What if I told you that your camera has a tool that will help you tell if you're getting properly exposed images every single time? If you've ever struggled with not knowing if or why your pictures get blown out, or if they're too dark and you lose details, then this video is for you, and we're going to be talking through histograms for beginners. Now, I'm going to keep it really simple and not get super technical, and I'm going to show you how to use a histogram to measure your exposures and make sure the appropriate adjustments are made to compensate. Now, histograms, what are they? A lot of people who are new to photography often ignore this super powerful tool, and if you're not familiar, you've probably seen the histogram before on your camera. Either you've accidentally come across it or you've seen it in an editor before, but a histogram usually looks like this. It's a waveform between two vertical bars, and there are two main types of histograms. There's your luminance histograms, which is basically the one I just showed you, what everyone talks about normally when they reference histograms. And there's an RGB histogram, more on those later. So we'll talk about luminance histograms. The luminance histogram measures the tonal values from black to white and all of the grays in between for every color that your camera sensor is seeing. It will tell you roughly how much of your composition is taken up by these values, as well as if you are overexposed and losing information by blowing it out, or clipping or underexposed and losing information in the blacks that are being clipped or cropped off. This is the histogram on my camera. Maybe yours looks a little bit different, but most cameras have a way of viewing the histogram either upon reviewing the photo if you have an older DSLR camera, or if you have a newer mirrorless camera, you can view it live through the viewfinder. It's just a setting. Oftentimes you can toggle it if you have a display option on the back button of your camera. Other than that, it might be in the settings. Now, how do we use this tool to measure things? Well, on the left side, you have absolute black lowlights, and on the right side, you have the absolute white highlights. The waveform in the middle shows where your current image falls on that specific spectrum. Now, we want to make sure that we adjust our camera settings to make sure that that waveform is not pressed up against either line, as that will blow out or clip your highlights or lowlights. If you hit the wall on the right, you've hit pure white and there's nothing left that can be recovered. If you hit the wall on the left, it's pure black and it can't be recovered either. What this means is that the information in those sections can't be saved or reworked in your editing program of choice. You've lost that information in those overexposed or underexposed sections. Now, a properly exposed image means that almost all of our values are going to be contained within the far left and far right of those bars. I'm speaking generally. There are some artistic reasons to want to intentionally clip and cut off information in the highlights or lowlights. But for most uses, you want to be within that. Because if we're in the middle, we can push that information around in our editing suite without getting weird artifacts and losing information or not being able to recover it all. Now, let's quickly touch on those RGB histograms. RGB stands for red, green, and blue color channels. On screens or digital devices, we add these colors together to varying degrees to make all the colors that we perceive. So on top of just the hues, however, there is luminance in the colors as well, and we touched at this before. So some reds can be almost white or almost black, same with blue and green. Now, I personally don't pay as close attention to these because I'm primarily shooting events and people, so I don't have a lot of time to get down into the nitty-gritty. But when I am taking like a macro image or a landscape photo, then I'll use these RGB channels as my main guides along with the luminance histogram. A real-world example of this would be maybe a macro photographer who's trying to take an image of a red ladybug on a green leaf, and that's all there is in the picture. So they're going to pay attention to those red and green histograms as their guidance for taking the shot and kind of ignore the blue one. And this is a side note, but we want to be shooting all of our photographs in RAW whenever possible, as it allows us to capture the most information available to our camera. And we also want to be able to manually manipulate it in our editors if we need to without sacrificing image quality. If you shoot JPEG, it compresses the image and your camera is making a decision to throw out information that you might have to recover later. If you want to get more into RAW versus JPEG and why you should always shoot RAW and what the benefits are, you should watch our video on that, which is coming out pretty soon. So let's take a look at some real-world examples of histograms from readings on some photos that my wife and I have taken for clients and what those histogram readings are telling us.
All right, so we're in Lightroom and we're going to take a look at clipping and why it's not a great thing and why you actually can't, correct for it in post-production. So if you're in Lightroom or something like that, you can't actually recover the data that you've clipped. And I will explain a little bit more of why that's the case in this, and I'll show you some examples of an image right now that's on screen where I overexposed, and then how I corrected in camera. And then I'll also show you how we can correct for some of these things in post if we get close to clipping but don't actually clip. And this is why it's important to read your Luminance histograms while you're taking your pictures in the field so that you can recover data. And let me show you what I mean by we can't recover data. And so in this one, we can't recover data because if we look up here on the right, in Lightroom here, up in the corner is your histogram. If I hover over this upper arrow up here, it'll show me everywhere that is clipped out information, meaning this is pure white. There's nothing else there that can be recovered. And everything that's red right now on screen is clipped. And on the reverse side, we'll show you a little bit later, it'll show you the same thing, but with your blacks, and I'll show you that. If we're looking at this, this is all overexposed, meaning we can't compensate for that to get this cloudy sky back that I know was there, because we're going to go and slide this all the way over to the left, and there's some of that cloudy sky, but we can't really do too much with it because there's some pixels there that are always just going to be white. There's more detail in these clouds here where I'm hovering my cursor that we're just not going to get. And you can get really into masking and stuff like that, but there's a lot of data there that we just can't get back. And I'll show you how I compensated for this. And let's just look at my settings on my camera. So ISO 800 at my 24, f 4.0, and I was at 1/60th of a second. And if we go look at the next image here, you'll see that my exposure is way better because I'm still dialing things in here. So almost nothing is clipped there. Let's go over it. Nope. I don't see anything obvious that's clipping in the darks, and in the whites, nothing super obvious. And here's what I mean about recovering data. So if we go into the highlights here, we can blow them out intentionally, but we can also recover some of that data. And look, it's not doing anything to the rest of my image in the lower 2/3 here. And that's fine because that's what I want. So you see here in this image, the way that I shifted some of my highlights over to be something that's like usable and recoverable is that I actually closed down a little bit and I went to an f8 aperture instead of 4. And what that's going to do is it's going to let way less light into my camera. And so what happens there is, it kind of shifts the exposure over just a little bit. It shifts all of the information on the Luminance histogram over so that the camera can read all of the details from black to white without clipping anything off. So using this, I was able to then get my exposure correct out of camera. And so I'll show you my final edit here. I just stepped a little bit closer to it, but you can see all of my settings are the same. And let's take a look. I actually pushed this image just a little bit to give myself a little bit more in the higher end, because if you look before my edits, a little bit too dark in the highlights, and I wanted it to be a little bit closer to white, so I was able to push it there. But the cool thing about this is, remember, when I say we don't want to clip, or if we want to clip intentionally, we can. And so let's say I want this to be an even darker image. I can help it out in the blacks by clipping some of them, and that's fine. If I want it to be super dark and moody image, I can lower my exposure, right? And we can intentionally make it that way. But let's say I don't want it to look this way, and right out of camera, there is all of this clipping. There's not really much we can do to recover that. So that's why we want to get it right in camera, so that we can do, the edits that we need to adjust, and we don't lose information. So let's move on to another example.
All right, so we talked about overexposing and underexposing. Now, what happens if we have like a properly exposed image or like a squished image, which doesn't feel like it has a lot of contrast in it, or maybe it's weighty in one area or another? Well, let's take a look at this picture that we took at a couples photo session that we did a few weeks ago. And if we're looking at it here on our histogram, upper right-hand corner here, we'll see that nothing is really clipped. We'll press these. Yeah, nothing's really clipped in either direction, right? But we have this huge, like, squished histogram here, and things look just a little bit flat. When it's squished like that, we would call it a low contrast. Actually, what happened here is I actually, instead of exposing so that everything is perfectly exposed in the center and creating a nice arc right up here, I actually did what's called exposing to the left. That's a personal preference of mine. I prefer to have images that are a little bit darker and moodier. So I usually lean towards like exposures that allow me to have like rich, darker blacks. Because I normally edit to like this part of the spectrum anyway, so I'm a lot closer to what my final product would be. So as you develop your own style and how you learn to edit and play around with things, you'll learn like what you do and don't like. So for me, this is perfectly exposed. But if we're looking at this, it's kind of squished, right? So everything's kind of lumped into like this mid-tone range, and it looks kind of flat. There's not much contrast, but we can work with this in our editor to help out a bit without losing any information. And what's good about this is because nothing's clipped, we're not going to add any grain to our photo by just playing around with like simple edits and things like that. So I would always take an image that we would say is like more flat and like right out of camera than a clipped image any day of the week, because I can always intentionally clip as we looked at before. That's why the goal is to get everything right in camera. So really there's not much I would do to this. Looks like I leaned on my computer here and I boosted the highlights. I actually don't want to do that. All right, so we're back at neutral. So really for this, the way to add more contrast is to spread this section out just a little bit. And that will add more contrast, or separate your darks from your lights so you don't have much in the middle of your histogram there. And you can see we do have a little bump because there's some highlights up and around here in our photo. And so if we want to create some more contrast, we can boost the highlights. And as you can see, we're boosting them into clipping, which is fine because her dress is white and this is the rim light here. So it's not jarring for our eyes to see rim lighting on people as something that's clipped. As long as it's not, yeah, well, that's like pretty egregious, right? And we'll see what it looks like off, right? You know, there's texture in her sweater. So we're going to bring it back just a little bit. So we've got some of that texture again. And then what we could do is we can bring the shadows down just a little bit. And already you can see we're clipping right here a little bit in his jacket, which is fine. We don't need to see what's under there anyway. So if we just look at like the back and forth here, there's a pretty big difference there. But what we could do is we can shift, and we're starting to clip in places that don't really matter, pieces of the hair here. And that's what I mean about intentional clipping. Like no one's really going to notice that. But now we have a much better image. And the other thing you can do to kind of like rip your image left to right a little bit faster and kind of split it down the center is to boost your contrast slider, which I don't actually like doing all that much. I usually don't go past plus or minus 25 on here if I'm pretty close to where I was before. So, you know, a little bit flatter. Now it pops a little bit. And the only thing I would do here is I would maybe just add some global color.
Color temperature got right out of there, and now this is kind of as shot, and you can see as we messed with some of our colors, our luminance values got changed a little bit. But this is, you know, well, let's look at the whole before and after. This is the before and after, and I would say this is pretty much for me. This is a deliverable image. Like if a client wanted me to touch up their teeth or blemishes or anything like that, I usually do. But yeah, I'm super happy with that, and this is why I would take a kind of like a squished image. You can see there, because we can kind of rip it apart a little bit. You know, we can spread it out and create more contrast, right? But yeah, I'm loving this. This is a lot better. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Out of these three examples, the one with the squished histogram is the one that I would prefer to walk away with, as there's more information there and nothing is getting clipped out. We just need to manually draw it out. So it's always better to work to develop your skills to get the shot as close to finished as you can directly in camera. The reason for that is because you want to spend less time editing than you need to, especially when you're doing a wedding and you walk away with 3,000 photos. Now let's talk about some exceptions. For example, sometimes there's just dark settings and environments that you're going to have to take pictures in. For example, a low-key light style, then you're going to have to hit absolute black on your camera. Or in a high-key setting, or maybe in an area where you have a model in front of a white backdrop, there's going to be a lot of areas where your camera might be saying like, hey, we are pretty close or completely blown out on the whites here, but you can tell just by looking at the image that that's not true. So that's a time when it's okay to blow out the lights. Or maybe there's you don't have your ND filter, so you're just going to expose for your subject, and who cares if the sky is blown out, because maybe you're going to go back in and do a sky replacement later. So there you have it, histograms for beginners. Let me know what video I should make next down in the comments, and I will see you on the next one.